There is a photograph that has been locked away in a Tennessee courthouse basement for over 70 years. No historian has published it. No documentary has shown it. The few people who have seen it describe the same thing: a wedding party standing on church steps, smiling, but something is wrong with their faces, something that makes your stomach turn before your mind can explain why. The priest who officiated that ceremony never performed another wedding. He never spoke about what happened that day, and 3 months after the wedding, he left the ministry entirely. This is the story of the Whitlock-Whitlock wedding of 1952, and why the state of Tennessee tried to erase it from public record. Hello everyone. Before we start, make sure to like and subscribe to the channel and leave a comment with where you're from and what time you're watching. That way, YouTube will keep showing you stories just like this one. The town of Cutter's Gap sits in the Appalachian Mountains, population 473 at its peak in 1949. By the time this wedding took place, most of the young people had already fled to Knoxville or Chattanooga. The ones who stayed were bound there by something deeper than economics. They were bound by blood. Not the blood of patriotism or community, but literal, traceable blood that had been circulating through the same dozen family names for over 150 years. The Whitlock family controlled most of the arable land in Cutter's Gap. They owned the general store, the lumber mill, and held positions as deacons in the only church for 15 miles. They were not wealthy by American standards, but in that isolated pocket of Tennessee, they were royalty. And like royalty throughout history, they had a problem. They had been marrying each other for 5 generations. It started innocently enough, the way these things always do. Cousins marrying cousins in the 1800s when travel was difficult and outsiders were rare. Then it became tradition. Then it became preference. Then it became pathology. By the time Samuel Whitlock proposed to his second cousin, Mary Whitlock, in 1951, there were children in that town who could trace their lineage back to the same great-great-grandparents through 4 different paths. Some through their mother's side, some through their father's, some through both. The wedding was scheduled for June 14, 1952. Father Michael Hennessy, a young priest recently assigned to the rural parish, was told he would be officiating. He had only been in Cutter's Gap for 8 months. He did not yet understand what he was looking at when the families gathered for the pre-wedding meeting. 16 people crammed into the church vestry. 16 people who all shared the same narrow-set eyes, the same sloping forehead, the same thin upper lip. 16 people who moved with an unsettling similarity, like reflections in a hall of mirrors. Father Hennessy later told a colleague that he felt a creeping dread during that meeting, though he could not articulate why. He said the room smelled wrong, not unclean, but genetically wrong, as if the air itself had been breathed and re-breathed too many times by the same lungs. The bride was 23 years old. The groom was 26. On paper, this seemed normal enough, but Father Hennessy began asking questions that made the family uncomfortable. He asked about their relationship. Mary said they had known each other since childhood, which was true. Samuel said they had always felt a special connection, which was also true. Then Father Hennessy asked about their parents. Mary's father and Samuel's mother were brother and sister. But that was not the only connection. Mary's mother and Samuel's father were also second cousins, which meant that Samuel and Mary were related through both of their parents, creating what geneticists call a pedigree collapse, where the family tree does not expand outward like branches, but folds back on itself like a knot. Father Hennessy went to his bishop. He explained the situation. He asked if the church could refuse to perform the ceremony on moral grounds. The bishop told him that Tennessee law allowed first cousins to marry, and second cousins required no legal permission at all. The church could not intervene in what the state permitted. Father Hennessy asked what about God's law. The bishop told him to perform the ceremony and pray for guidance. So he did. The wedding day arrived with unseasonable cold. June 14th, 1952, and the temperature in Cutter's Gap barely reached 58 degrees. The church was packed. 73 people attended, and Father Hennessy would later estimate that 60 of them were blood relatives of both the bride and groom. He said the congregation looked like a single organism, a biological echo chamber where the same genetic information had been copied and recopied until the errors became features. The ceremony began normally. The bridal march played on an out-of-tune piano. Mary walked down the aisle in a dress that had been worn by her grandmother, her mother, and her aunt, all Whitlock women, all married to Whitlock men. Samuel stood at the altar in a suit that pulled tight across his narrow shoulders. Father Hennessy opened his prayer book and began the rites. "Dearly beloved, we are gathered here today." His voice sounded hollow in the small church, swallowed by the humid air and the weight of what he was about to consecrate. Then he reached the part of the ceremony that asks if anyone objects to the union. He paused longer than usual. The silence stretched. Someone in the back pew coughed, a wet, rattling sound. Father Hennessy looked out at the congregation. He saw a little girl, no older than 7, sitting in the third row. She had the same face as the bride, not similar, the same sharp chin, the same wide set eyes, the same expression. Later, he learned that the little girl was Mary's niece, but also her second cousin, once removed through a different line. The child stared at him with an expression he could not read, not happiness, not sadness, something vacant and patient, as if she had been waiting her entire short life for this exact moment. Father Hennessy continued the ceremony. He had no choice, but his hands shook as he turned the pages. The vows were exchanged without incident, but Father Hennessy noticed something during the recitation, when Samuel repeated the words "to have" and "to hold." His voice carried a strange inflection, almost mechanical, as if he had heard these exact words spoken in this exact way many times before. Mary's voice had the same quality. It was not nerves, it was familiarity. The kind of familiarity that comes from hearing your parents' wedding vows, and your grandparents' wedding vows, and your great-grandparents' wedding vows, all spoken between people who shared the same last name before and after the ceremony. The reception was held in the church basement, tables covered in white cloth, food prepared by the women of the family, ham, biscuits, green beans cooked in fatback, a wedding cake with icing that had started to melt in the humid air. Father Hennessy was expected to attend, so he did. He stood near the back wall and watched the families eat and dance and celebrate. He watched the way they moved together in clusters, never straying far from their own. He watched the children, 11 of them, running between the tables with a coordinated chaos that seemed almost rehearsed. One of the guests approached him, an older man, maybe 60, with the Whitlock features weathered into deep lines. The man introduced himself as Thomas Whitlock, uncle to both the bride and groom through separate lines. He shook Father Hennessy's hand and thanked him for a beautiful ceremony. Then he said something that Father Hennessy never forgot. He said, "It's important to keep the blood pure, Father. Outsiders don't understand, but we do. We've always understood." Father Hennessy asked what he meant. Thomas smiled, showing teeth that were too small for his mouth. He said, "The land knows us. The land keeps us. We're part of it now, and it's part of us. You can't break that bond with strangers." Then he walked away, back into the crowd of identical faces. Father Hennessy left the reception early. He told the family he was feeling ill, which was true. He went back to his small room in the parish house and sat on the edge of his bed. He tried to pray, but could not find the words. Instead, he took out a notebook and began writing down everything he had observed. The names, the relationships, the way the family spoke about themselves as if they were a single entity rather than individuals. He wrote for 3 hours, filling 12 pages with details that would later become the only written record of what he had witnessed. 3 days after the wedding, Father Hennessy received a visit from 2 men. They did not introduce themselves, but they wore suits that marked them as outsiders, government men from Nashville or Knoxville. They asked him about the Whitlock family. They asked if he had noticed anything unusual. Father Hennessy told them everything. The men took notes. They asked if he had written anything down. He said yes and gave them the notebook. They thanked him and left. He never saw the notebook again. 2 weeks later, Father Hennessy was contacted by the Tennessee Department of Health. They wanted to speak with him about the Whitlock family. He met with a doctor named Raymond Castellano, a geneticist who had been quietly studying isolated communities in Appalachia since the end of World War II. Dr. Castellano told Father Hennessy that the state had been aware of Cutter's Gap for years, but had no legal authority to intervene. The families were not breaking any laws. They were simply exercising their right to marry within the bounds of what Tennessee permitted. But Dr. Castellano had reviewed birth records, death certificates, and census data going back to 1870. What he found was a genetic bottleneck so severe that it defied medical probability. The Whitlock family, along with 2 other intermarried families in Cutter's Gap, had an effective population size of less than 30 individuals over 5 generations. That meant the genetic diversity in that community was comparable to an endangered species on the brink of extinction. The consequences were already visible. Dr. Castellano showed Father Hennessy photographs. Children with congenital defects, adults with shortened lifespans, a pattern of mental illness that ran through the families like a river. He explained that when you concentrate recessive genes through repeated inbreeding, you do not just get physical abnormalities. You get cognitive decline. You get emotional instability. You get a community that stops functioning as individual human beings and starts functioning as a damaged collective, unable to see themselves clearly because they have never seen anyone who was not a reflection of themselves. Father Hennessy asked why the state did not do something. Dr. Castellano said they could not. The families were insular but not hostile. They paid their taxes, attended church, and kept to themselves. There was no legal mechanism to stop them from marrying each other, and any attempt to do so would be seen as government overreach, especially in rural Tennessee, where federal intervention was already viewed with suspicion. The only thing the state could do was document what was happening and hope that eventually the families would die out or dilute their bloodlines through contact with the outside world. But Father Hennessy learned something else during that conversation. He learned that the Whitlock-Whitlock wedding was not an isolated incident. It was part of a pattern that had been accelerating for decades. Between 1940 and 1950, there had been 9 weddings in Cutter's Gap. 8 of them were between blood relatives, and 6 of those were between second cousins or closer. The community was not just inbred, it was actively inbreeding generation after generation with increasing frequency and decreasing genetic diversity. Father Hennessy asked what would happen to the children of Samuel and Mary. Dr. Castellano did not answer immediately. Then he said, "If they have children, and those children survive, they will almost certainly have severe developmental issues. And if those children grow up and marry within the same family structure, which they likely will, then we are looking at a genetic dead end within 2 more generations." Father Hennessy felt something break inside him. He realized that he had not just witnessed a wedding, he had witnessed a slow-motion extinction event consecrated by the church and permitted by the state. Mary Whitlock became pregnant 4 months after the wedding. The pregnancy was difficult from the start. She experienced severe anemia, preeclampsia, and episodes of dissociation that her family attributed to nerves, but that Dr. Castellano suspected were symptoms of an underlying neurological condition common in highly inbred populations. Samuel took her to a doctor in Knoxville, 60 miles away, because there was no hospital in Cutter's Gap. The doctor examined her and immediately referred her to a specialist. The specialist took one look at her family medical history and told Samuel that his wife should not carry the pregnancy to term. Samuel refused to consider it. He said that God would provide. He took Mary back to Cutter's Gap, and the family cared for her in the way they had always cared for their own, with home remedies, with prayer, with a quiet resignation that whatever happened was meant to happen. Father Hennessy visited several times during those months. He brought communion, he offered comfort, but he also watched. He watched the way the family circled around Mary like white blood cells around an infection, protective and smothering. He watched the way they spoke about the baby as if it were already a member of the family, already part of the pattern, already locked into the same genetic loop that had defined them for 150 years. The baby was born in March of 1953, a boy. He lived for 6 days. Father Hennessy was called to perform last rites on the 5th day. He arrived at the Whitlock home and found the family gathered around a cradle in the front room. The baby was gray, struggling to breathe, his tiny chest rising and falling with a rhythm that was too fast and too shallow. Mary sat in a chair beside the cradle, her face blank, her hands folded in her lap. Samuel stood behind her, one hand on her shoulder, staring at the dying child with an expression that Father Hennessy later described as not grief, but acceptance. Father Hennessy performed the rites. He anointed the baby's forehead with oil. He prayed for the soul of this innocent child who had been born into a situation he never chose, into a family that loved him but could not save him from the genetic legacy they had created. The baby died the next morning. He was buried in the Whitlock family cemetery, a small plot on a hillside where 73 other Whitlocks had been buried over 4 generations. The headstone listed his name, his birth date, and his death date. It did not list his cause of death, but Father Hennessy knew. The baby had died because his parents were too closely related, because his grandparents were too closely related, because his great-grandparents were too closely related, and because no one had ever stopped the cycle. If you are still watching, you are already braver than most. Tell us in the comments, what would you have done if this was your bloodline? Father Hennessy left Cutter's Gap in July of 1953. He requested a transfer, and the bishop granted it without question. He never spoke publicly about the Whitlock family, but he kept a private journal that was discovered after his death in 1998. In it, he wrote about the wedding, the baby, and the realization that had driven him from the ministry. He wrote that he could no longer believe in a God who would allow such suffering to be consecrated in his name. The state of Tennessee sealed the records of Cutter's Gap in 1957, not because of any scandal, but because the town was dying. The population had dropped to less than 200, most of them elderly or children with profound disabilities. The younger generation, those who could leave, did. Those who remained were trapped by poverty, by loyalty, or by the cognitive and physical limitations that came from generations of inbreeding. The general store closed. The lumber mill shut down. The church held services once a month, then once every 2 months, then stopped entirely. By 1970, Cutter's Gap was functionally a ghost town. The few families that remained lived in houses that were falling apart, surrounded by land that no longer produced crops because no one had the knowledge or ability to farm it properly. The Whitlock family, once the most prominent in the area, had shrunk to fewer than a dozen members. Mary and Samuel had tried for more children but suffered 3 miscarriages before giving up. They lived in the same house where the first baby had died, and neighbors said they rarely spoke to each other, moving through their days like ghosts in a house haunted by their own genetics. Dr. Castellano continued to monitor the situation from a distance. He published a paper in 1973, carefully anonymized, about the genetic consequences of prolonged endogamy in isolated populations. He did not name Cutter's Gap, but anyone familiar with the area would have recognized the details. The paper was largely ignored by the academic community. Genetic research was focused on disease prevention and medical advancements, not on documenting the slow collapse of rural communities that most people preferred to forget. But the paper caught the attention of a journalist named Ellen Marsh, who worked for a regional newspaper in Knoxville. She spent 6 months investigating Cutter's Gap, interviewing former residents, reviewing public records, and eventually tracking down Father Hennessy's journal through a contact in the Catholic diocese. She wrote a series of articles that were published in the spring of 1975, detailing the history of inbreeding in the community and the state's failure to intervene. The articles caused a brief uproar, but it faded quickly. By that point, Cutter's Gap was already past saving, and the public's appetite for stories about rural decay was limited. Ellen Marsh tried to visit Cutter's Gap to take photographs and conduct interviews. She drove out to the town in June of 1975 and found it almost completely abandoned. A few houses still had people living in them, but they would not speak to her. They watched from windows and doorways, silent and suspicious, their faces carrying the unmistakable Whitlock features, even if their last names had changed through marriage. She took photographs of the empty church, the overgrown cemetery, and the collapsed remains of the general store. She tried to find Mary and Samuel Whitlock, but no one would tell her where they lived. After 3 days, she left, and she never returned. The last recorded resident of Cutter's Gap died in 2004. The town was officially removed from the census. The land was reclaimed by the state and eventually sold to a timber company. The church was torn down. The cemetery was fenced off but otherwise left untouched, a collection of weathered headstones slowly sinking into the earth. The photograph that was mentioned at the beginning, the one locked in the courthouse basement, was never officially catalogued. It exists in a box of unclaimed records from rural churches that were closed or demolished in the second half of the 20th century. A historian named David Kern found it in 2011 while researching property disputes in eastern Tennessee. He described it in his notes but did not reproduce it in any published work. He said the wedding party consisted of 12 people, 6 on the bride's side and 6 on the groom's side, all of them displaying what he called a disturbing uniformity of features. He said the bride and groom stood in the center, holding hands, and that their faces were turned toward the camera with expressions that were not quite smiling, not quite blank, but something in between. He said the priest stood behind them, and that his face was the only one in the photograph that showed clear emotion. Fear. David Kern tried to find descendants of the Whitlock family to ask permission to publish the photograph. He could not find any. The family line, at least under that name, appears to have ended. There are people in Tennessee who carry Whitlock blood, diluted through marriages to outsiders, but none who identify with the community of Cutter's Gap or acknowledge the history of what happened there. The story has been buried, not by conspiracy, but by shame and the simple passage of time. Father Hennessy died in 1998 at the age of 76. He had left the priesthood in 1954, a year after the Whitlock baby died, and spent the rest of his life working as a high school teacher in Virginia. He never married. He never returned to Tennessee. In his final journal entry, written 2 weeks before his death, He wrote about the wedding. He wrote that he still saw their faces sometimes, in dreams and in moments of quiet. He wrote that he believed he had failed them, not by performing the ceremony, but by not having the courage to refuse. He wrote that he should have stood in that church and said no, consequences be damned, because some things are too broken to be blessed. The story of Cutter's Gap and the Whitlock-Whitlock wedding is not unique. There are other communities, other families, other weddings that followed the same pattern. Some in Appalachia, some in the rural Midwest, some in isolated parts of the Southwest. They are rarely documented and even more rarely discussed because they represent something uncomfortable about American history. They represent the cost of isolation, the danger of insularity, and the way that tradition can become pathology when it is never questioned. The lesson, if there is one, is not about genetics. It is about what happens when a community turns inward so completely that it can no longer see itself clearly. It is about the difference between preserving heritage and preserving harm. And it is about the responsibility we have as individuals and as a society to recognize when love has become something else, something that wears the mask of tradition but carries the weight of tragedy. The priest never spoke again about the wedding, but his silence said more than words ever could. Some truths are too heavy to carry, and some stories are too dark to forget. This was one of them.